So, in my experience, it's good to begin a lecture either with a joke or an apology. And since I don't have any jokes at the moment, like Marcel, I'm going to begin with an apology.
That's actually typically German.
I'm sorry?
Apology is actually typical German.
Oh, okay. All right, well, I'm German. I didn't know. So my apology is this, that when Professor Tammer invited me, a year ago, to give this paper by email, at first I tried to ignore him, and then when that was no longer possible, I responded and said, you know, I really don't think I'm the right person to do this. And the reason that I said that was because I'm not a Muslim. And by that, I did not mean to suggest that only Muslims should study or talk about Islam, or only Jews, Judaism, or Christians, Christianity. Not at all. That's a road down which I think lies the end of the university as we know it, the end of critical inquiry and liberal education. But it was clear to me that in addition to the scholarly side of this event and these events, that there was an ecumenical aspect as well, something that I very much approve of. And since I'm not a Muslim, I cannot do what, for example, Reza did so eloquently yesterday afternoon and this morning, talk about prayer from a Muslim perspective. I'm just a historian, and so all I can really do is to talk about a little bit about what Islam looks like to me from the outside. Moreover, I'm a social historian. And so picking up on what we were talking about at the very end, you know, there are different ways of thinking about this topic of religious learning. And I may have interpreted my approach to it a little bit differently than others have. As a social historian, my interests are less with the tradition of religious learning. I'm not involved in the process of religious learning in the way that either Marcel or Sandra are. I'm interested in how religious learning has been experienced and how it's been institutionalized and how experiences and institutions have evolved over time. So that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly this morning. So the topic is religious learning in Islam, and I will get to that topic shortly. But I think we need to begin the discussion by considering a different but related topic, and that is knowledge, the Arabic word for which is ʿilm, which is up there on the screen. Cilm is the object of religious learning. Knowledge and its transmission are fundamental to any account of the religion of Islam. Reza, a few moments ago, invoked Franz Rosenthal and his marvelous work, Knowledge Triumphant. In that book, Rosenthal went so far as to say that cilm is Islam. So this observation, I think, is linked to another truism, that Islam is a religion of the book. The book here, of course, means the Muslim scripture, which in its fully developed form includes both the Qur'anic revelation as well as the more vaguely defined corpus of traditions, or Hadith, through which Muslims have glimpsed and learned to emulate the Prophet Muhammad. In the Muslim view, the Qur'an and the Hadith together constitute the channels through which God makes himself known. In both popular and scholarly discussions, that Islam is a religion of the book ties Islam to Jewish and Christian traditions. Consequently, all three of these traditions are textual traditions. And the thing about texts is that they have to be learned. They have to be studied and commented upon, hence the importance of learning and education to the fully developed Muslim tradition. So the object of religious learning, cilm, lay at the center of pre-modern Muslim religious experience. And by the way, most of my remarks today are going to focus on the pre-modern period, although I will turn at the end of my lecture to developments in the modern world. Ilm forms a recurring topic of the Quranic revelations. Knowledge and related terms are amongst the most frequently encountered words in the Qur'an. The scripture, I believe, contains over 750 occurrences of words derived from the root Ain, Lam, Mim. The divine origin of Ilm knowledge is a bedrock assumption of the Qur'an. God knows and you do not know, the scripture frequently reminds us. We can only know what God wills us to know. Even the angels can only know what God has taught them. Rosenthal suggested that the Quranic obsession with knowledge may have been linked to Eastern Christian and Gnostic influences. The centrality of knowledge to the Muslim worldview is reflected in the fact that the pre-Islamic period is popularly referred to as the Jahiliyyah, usually translated as the time of ignorance. Now, eventually, Muslims developed a more variegated understanding of and vocabulary for knowledge. So, for example, philosophers use other terms to describe the object of their intellectual endeavors, especially hikmah, which is sometimes translated as wisdom. And Sufi mystics developed alternative paths to the knowledge of God, which they described with various words, including ma'rifa, which means knowledge, but which is derived from a different Arabic root than ilm. This mystical knowledge, the Sufis believed, was not necessarily obtained through disciplined study and learning, but rather through sudden and unpredictable flashes of insight. The term ilm itself came eventually to have multiple meanings, reflected in the use of its plural form, ulum. In the modern world, ilm and ulum are used in connection with virtually any field of knowledge. They indicate, in effect, what we in the academy mean by the term discipline. Nonetheless, the term ilm retained a fundamentally religious aura. Ilm knowledge was knowledge about what God desires for us and what he expects us to do. At the core of ilm, therefore, lay the religious sciences, especially the Prophetic traditions and Islamic law, at least once that law was fully developed by the 10th century or so. The term for one who knows, alim, or in its more familiar plural form, ūlamāʼ, can in modern Arabic mean scholar generally or even scientist, but in the pre-modern period referred specifically to those who were well versed in the religious sciences. Now, this religious knowledge was highly valued. Most of the principal collections of Hadith contain multiple traditions describing the value of ilm and those who pursue it. Most of them have a separate chapter highlighting Hadith about knowledge and position it at the beginning of the collection. All Muslims were encouraged to embrace religious knowledge and to strive for it, at least to the degree possible and appropriate. Reza has already quoted the Prophet as saying, seek knowledge even as far away as China. Muslim writers such as Ghazali, perhaps drawing on Aristotle's assertion at the beginning of his Metaphysics that all men naturally desire knowledge, spoke of the pleasure which knowledge imparted. The 14th century scholar Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya described his own attraction to knowledge as a kind of ishq, an Arabic word for love, which has erotic overtones. A story told about the great legal scholar Shafi'i drew playfully on the link between knowledge and the erotic. According to this tale, Shafi'i's students, worried that their teacher was too consumed with his studies for his own good, purchased for him a slave girl. The young woman, leaning into her assigned role, repeatedly sought to seduce the scholar, but he resisted all of her advances. Finally, in frustration, she returned to the slave dealer who had sold her, complaining that he had bound her to a crazy man, to which Shafi'i responded, the crazy man is the one who knows the value of knowledge and hesitates so that it passes him by. Now, like any other form of knowledge, ilm knowledge had to be transmitted from one generation to the next, hence our topic today, right? Religious learning in Islam. Already by the 9th century, if not before, Muslims were thinking and writing reflectively about learning and instruction, about the ideal qualities of students and teachers and the proper relationship between them. From that literature, we can reconstruct a fairly clear picture of how and to what end instruction in the religious sciences was supposed to take place. In its initial stages, Islamic religious education was focused, simple, and uniform. The principal goal was to master the Qur'an. That meant learning how to read the difficult Arabic text and how to pronounce its words. The practical goal of a primary education was to memorize the Qur'an. Of course, the situation would differ for students depending on whether or not they were native speakers of Arabic. It's worth remembering, however, that the memorization of and the ability to read and pronounce Quranic verses was a pious activity in and of itself, regardless of the degree of comprehension, since the text represented the literal speech of God. Moreover, it's important not to dismiss this step in a religious education as simple or rote memorization, as many both in the West and among modernizing Muslim reformers have done. The memorization of the Qur'an and the ability to reproduce its verses at appropriate moments constituted a kind of cultural capital, which a student might subsequently deploy in both his education and his career. It was also an important component of a process of socialization, which lay at the heart of more advanced stages of religious learning, something I'll come back to in a moment. This primary education was probably fairly widespread. Often it might take place in the home, and students receive instruction from family members. Mosques were the principal venue for the instruction of boys, at least. To this day, of course, study circles in which children study and memorize the Qur'an are familiar sights in mosques throughout the Muslim world. Eventually, a loose network of primary schools grew up in many cities. How widespread this initial phase of education was, however, is, I think, one of the most interesting and probably unanswerable questions about pre-modern Islamic societies. I have the impression that literacy was much more common in medieval Muslim communities than it was, say, in pre-modern European societies. But I'm not aware of convincing studies of the problem, nor of how one might even go about trying to answer the question. Of course, it also raises the interesting question of what exactly it means to be literate. Much more can be said about what we might call higher education, the topics and methods and framework of learning after a student had mastered Arabic and the Qur'an. The process, that is, of becoming one of the ʿulamāʼ. By the Islamic Middle Period, several distinct fields of religious learning had crystallized, all of which clustered around the central issue of ʿilm, knowledge. How is one to know what God's intentions for us were? Islamic education, like Islamic self, began with the Qur'an. Consequently, one field of religious study was tafsir, something we've already invoked, commentary on the Qur'an, a discipline which involved primarily linguistic and historical analysis of Quranic verses. Another field of study focused on the prophetic traditions, or Hadith. The study of Hadith was especially important for several reasons. In the first place, the emphasis on transmitting one's knowledge of Hadith through a string of personal contacts, linking the student with the author or the source of a text, became paradigmatic for religious education as a whole, something I'll come back to in a moment. Secondly, the crystallization of the definitive corpus of Hadith, the definitive textual corpus, took place in the same area and at roughly the same time as the first steps in the emergence of institutions devoted specifically to instruction in the religious sciences. And those two developments were probably linked. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the central subject of Islamic religious education was jurisprudence, the study of Islamic law. This was one of the central arguments of George Makdasy's seminal work on the rise of the madrasa, which became the most important institution of learning in virtually all subsequent Muslim societies. Indeed, as Makdasy stressed, the very vocabulary of education and learning was intimately associated with Islamic law. The basic terminology of religious education derived from the Arabic root dal-ra-sin, such as madrasa or school, dars, lesson, mudaris, professor, and so on. These terms could be used when qualified with other terms to indicate other areas of knowledge and study. However, on their own, they typically refer to the study and teaching of Islamic law. Well, there's much to say about the system and culture of transmitting Islamic religious knowledge, that is, of religious learning. For the present moment, and given our limited time, I would mention two of its most important characteristics. The first is that it was a fundamentally personal system. The critical element involved intimate contact between two humans, between teacher and pupil. This was in part a function of the strong preference in Muslim societies for the oral transmission of knowledge and of texts. Even when a work was written, when a text took written form, its transmission through oral recitation was understood to be superior, even necessary. That preference in turn was linked to the importance of the study of Hadith, to religious learning. The ulama were aware from an early stage of the danger posed by traditions purporting to be from Muhammad, which were in fact false. Consequently, they emphasized the importance of direct personal contact between those transmitting Hadith to those receiving them. They insisted, that in order to be accepted as genuine, a tradition should be reported based on an unbroken chain of transmission, or an isnad as it's called, linking the one reporting a tradition to the Prophet himself. This privileging of oral transmission and personal contact imposed itself on the entire ecosystem of religious learning. It's reflected in what became the most important public declaration of educational accomplishment, namely the ijaza. The ijaza was a certification by a teacher that a particular student had studied a particular text under his supervision, typically reciting the text orally, or that the student had mastered under his supervision a larger body of knowledge. The certification, in other words, was a personal one, contingent upon some form of direct contact between teacher and pupil. This preference for the oral transmission of texts and for the teacher's personal certification that a student has mastered it has been thoroughly described by Makdisi and other historians. It constitutes, I think, one of those places where the Muslim and Jewish experience can perhaps be fruitfully compared. But there are areas of ambiguity. For example, an educational system privileging and relying upon personal relationships did so paradoxically in a world that was saturated with physical written books. The coexistence of recitational forms and their written versions was taken for granted, the anthropologist Brinkley Messick has observed, and so produced what he called a flourishing culture of the book. The sheer number of books produced by medieval Muslims was, by comparison to other pre-modern societies, impressive. But it's important to remember that medieval Muslims may not have conceptualized the book in quite the same way that we do. The preference for oral transmission was such that, in a very real sense, a book did not exist until it was pronounced out loud. Oral enactment was even the dominant mode of composition of texts. In this way, the oral and personal character of learning was preserved. Books were literally embodied and were experienced as a kind of ritual practice, performed rather than read. Now, a second feature of the system and culture of transmitting Islamic religious knowledge is related to its oral and personal character. The process of learning was very much a social one. There was a social element even to the intellectual goals of a religious education, as several recent anthropological studies have stressed. Brinkley Messick, for example, has described the academic environment of pre-modern Islamic societies as a textual polity, one which bound its practitioners together by an interlocking nexus of texts and commentaries. Dale Eichelman's study of the education of a 20th century Moroccan Qadi, a judge of an Islamic court, showed how a religious scholar's education bound him in personal relationships not only to his teachers, but to his peers, to his fellow students, in a community of learning and commentary. This social element is evident in the language which pre-modern Muslim writers used to describe religious education. Hence, for example, the term suhba, companionship, or as Makdisi translated it, fellowship, used to describe the relationship between teacher and pupil. The ulama were bound together as a group by their training, but the social relations amongst them were fundamentally hierarchical. Suhba, in fact, usually implied not simply companionship, but a relationship rooted in authority and dependence and deference, that of a master and disciple. Dialectical disputation, what's known as munazara, occupied a critical stage of education in the religious sciences, particularly in the field of jurisprudence. Through the resulting competition, a successful scholar might claim preeminence or riyasa over his rivals. The very methodologies of the transmission of religious knowledge implied a kind of hierarchy. The choreography of classes and the religious subjects were carefully staged. Students were arranged in a circle, with advanced students and those with the closest relationship to the teacher seated in nearest proximity to him. On a psychological level, memorization, not simply of the Qur'an and Hadith, but of textbooks as well, may have served to reinforce the hierarchy and the authority of the teacher and of the textual polity. One of the most remarkable things about Islamic religious education, I think, is how little institutional support it received for the first 3 or 4 centuries of Islamic history. The system I've described grew up on its own, outside of any institutional structure. Teachers met with their students in mosques, in private homes, sometimes in the marketplace or other public spaces. Scholars might occasionally receive gifts from rulers or other members of the ruling elite. However, a general awareness of the dangers of close entanglement with political authorities bred a spirit of independence on the part of the ʿulamāʼ. One consequence is that there was no regular mechanism of payment for those engaged in the transmission of religious knowledge. Teachers supported themselves in other ways. Sometimes they received direct payments from students. More often, they engaged in other unrelated lines of work, as merchants, for example. That last point, I think, is especially important. It reminds us that while the ulama had become a self-conscious social group by the 3rd or 4th century of the Muslim era, they were at first in no way an exclusive group. They were not consecrated and set apart like the Christian clergy, nor were they distinguished by employment or profession. All of that changed with the rise of the madrasa, beginning in the 10th and 11th centuries. The madrasa has been the subject of many studies since the publication of George Makdasy's seminal book on the rise of colleges in 1980. In that book, Makdasy identified the madrasa as an institution devoted to instruction in the most important of the Islamic religious sciences, the law. What I'd like to do in my remaining time is first to survey what we've learned about that institution. Second, identify 3 debates which have emerged in the secondary literature. And finally, suggest how the questions those debates have posed may point us in the direction of a more comprehensive understanding of learning and education in the pre-modern Islamic world, and how that narrative sets the stage for important changes in what might be called Muslim modernity. So institutions known as madrasas first appear in Khorasan in northeastern Iran in the late 9th and 10th centuries. That venue is important. Khorasan was the center of the recording and study of Hadith, which in precisely the same time period became recognized as the most important, at least in practical terms, of the sources of Islamic law. The madrasa was a private institution. Each one was established by an individual as an act of charity. In addition to building a structure to house the school, the founder provided for the institution's operation by setting aside property in an endowment. The madrasa flourished first in Bukhara, then in Nishapur, where most of the earliest institutions were founded by scholars themselves or by other members of the civilian elite. From Nishapur, the madrasa spread through the central Islamic lands, the territories in Iran and Iraq ruled by the Seljuk sultans, then the militarized Turkish regimes of the Fertile Crescent, including the Ayyubids, until reaching its zenith perhaps under the Mamluk sultans who ruled from Cairo from the mid-13th to the early 16th century. In this period, the pattern of establishing the madrasa changed. Sultans and other members of the ruling elites began to eclipse scholars and civilians as the institution's patrons. Under the patronage of the Ayyubids, Mamluks, and other rulers, the madrasa became one of the most common features of the medieval Islamic cityscape. There are at least 3 historiographical debates concerning the madrasa that have emerged in the wake of George Makdasy's pioneering book. The first concerns the basic purpose of the new schools and how they related to larger political and cultural developments. The madrasa has often been cast as a central fixture in what has variously been called the Sunni revival or Renaissance or Reformation or recentering of the 11th century. This development involved the reestablishment of Sunni hegemony after a century or so of Shi'i political dominance. In this light, some historians saw in the proliferation of the madrasas an attempt to cultivate a cadre of educated officials to help administer the newly established Sunni regimes. Another element of the Sunni revival to which the madrasa was putatively attached was the crystallization of a sort of Sunni theological orthodoxy, identified as Asharism, which strove to steer a middle course between the apparent anthropomorphism of a strident traditionalist like Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the rationalism of the Mu'tazilis, whose ideas had been discredited following the collapse of the so-called Inquisition, the Mihna of the 9th century. Well, there's been much discussion in recent years concerning the contours and even the very notion of a Sunni revival. Some of the assumptions of earlier scholars about the madrasa, for example, that its fluorescence was tied to the establishment of Ash'ari theological orthodoxy, these assumptions are no longer sustainable. But while the lines of connection may be complicated, there is no doubt that the spread of madrasas was connected to politics. In particular, it was tied to the stridently Sunni politics of the militarized Turkish regimes, which dominated the Middle East in the Islamic Middle Period. This is so despite the fundamentally private nature of the institution, each of which was founded as an individual private act of charity rather than through an official government project. The connection rests on the fact that, at least after the early years, most madrasas were established by members of the ruling elites. There are multiple examples of this involving all the major regimes of the period, the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, and others, and in the fuller version of this talk, I'll describe them at some length. But the central point is that the fate of institutions of religious learning and that of the military regimes which sponsored them became intimately intertwined. The second historiographical debate concerns the relationship between, on the one hand, the madrasa as an institution devoted specifically to the study of Islamic jurisprudence, and on the other, competing fields of knowledge. A central element of Makdazi's account of the madrasa was that it was specifically and exclusively devoted to the teaching of fiqh, jurisprudence. Makdazi acknowledged that other subjects might occasionally occupy a supportive place in the madrasa curriculum, subjects such as hadith or the Arabic language, but they did so, he said, as ancillary to the teaching of jurisprudence, which was and remained the central purpose of the institution. Well, there's no reason to doubt Makdazi's fundamental insight that the madrasa as an institutional type was in origin, by and large, remained devoted to the study and teaching of Islamic law. But the situation on the ground could be complicated. So, for example, as I think I demonstrated in my own book on the madrasa in Mamluk Cairo, lots of things went on inside madrasas, some of them having little to do with legal study. Moreover, there were institutions identified as madrasas which made no provision for the teaching of law, although they did provide for other educational or spiritual activities. One way to explain this, I argued, was that the transmission of knowledge remained fundamentally informal. It was unaffected by the institutional structure supporting it. Rather, it continued to be based on a system stressing the direct personal connection between teacher and pupil. One could even argue that this situation, in a way, affirmed the importance of jurisprudence. Thanks to the preference for oral transmission and the insistence upon the personal certification of scholarly accomplishment, the teaching of law would continue in institutions known as madrasas, even if they did not provide stipends and accommodations for teachers or students of the subject. An institution, for example, might provide resources to support Sufi activities, and yet be known to its audience as a madrasa, a situation which reflected the accommodation of medieval Sufi mystical orders to the centrality of Islamic law in the construction of Muslim identity. A more challenging question involves the relationship of the madrasa to the teaching of the rational sciences, philosophy, the natural sciences, and the like. Scholars such as the great Ignaz Goldziher once thought that the study of such subjects atrophied after the first Islamic centuries. Later historians, including Makdisi, recognized that the cultivation and transmission of such subjects continued through the Middle Period. Nonetheless, they insisted that the teaching of them was excluded from the madrasa. That there was tension between the religious and the rational sciences, and skepticism among some of the ulama about the legitimacy of the latter is certain. In the early 13th century, the Ayyubid emir of Damascus, al-Malik al-Ashraf Musa, ordered the fuqaha, that is the scholars of Islamic jurisprudence, those who worked in the madrasas, to avoid the study and the teaching of logic and the sciences of the ancients, and to concentrate exclusively on fiqh, jurisprudence, hadith, and Qur'anic interpretation. Moreover, he threatened to exile any scholars who disobeyed. But again, the situation on the ground was complex. The library of the religious complex of al-Ashraf Musa himself, which is sometimes referred to as a madrasa, included many books on the philosophical and rational sciences. It also included a number of works of Mu'tazili theology, which a previous generation of scholars believed the Sunni revival had effectively suppressed. At least one 13th century madrasa, the famous Mustansiriya in Baghdad, included provisions for a professor and students of medicine. Indeed, the further east one went, the more likely one was to find the teaching of the rational and natural sciences in institutions labeled madrasas. Madrasas established under the post-Mongol regimes, such as the Timurids and then the Mughals, frequently included classes in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and other subjects in their educational program. Sonia Brentjes has even argued that some of these topics, astronomy especially, made their way into the teaching which transpired in Mamluk madrasas. The final historiographical controversy concerns the impact of the madrasa. What effect did these institutions have on the teaching of Islamic law and on those who studied and taught it? That is, on the ulama and their religious learning. Makdisi wrote about education in very precise and formal terms. His analysis centered on the madrasa as an institution, positing that the new schools came to dominate and define the transmission of knowledge for those engaged in it. In my book on the madrasas of Cairo, I pointed out that in some ways the spread of these institutions had little impact on the actual transmission of knowledge. Biographical dictionaries of the medieval ulama, for example, almost never tell us where a particular scholar studied. What mattered was who their teachers were. The institutions themselves never offered anything like degrees. What certified a student's education as sound and legitimate was the ijaza that he acquired from individual scholars. In other words, the very personal and informal methods of transmitting knowledge which prevailed before the rise of the madrasa continued to define the system. In his study of knowledge and social practice in medieval Damascus, Michael Chamberlain took this idea much further. He denied that there was any kind of system of higher education, even an informal one, or that madrasas were, in any way were what he called specialized institutions of learning. Did Damascene madrasas have a curriculum, a privileged form of knowledge, which they attempted to inculcate in the students, he asked? Did they have any collective identity or organization? Did attendance at madrasas have anything to do with the transmission of elite status? His answer was basically no. In all the literature for high medieval Damascus, he wrote, there is not a single citation that this writer has found that any young person enrolled in a madrasa to acquired certified mastery in the law. Well, the debate over the madrasa has suffered, perhaps, from too much focus on terminology, on the meaning both of Arabic terms such as madrasa and of English words such as system and degrees. As we say in English, perhaps we have missed the forest for the trees. If instead we consider the madrasa within the social and political strategies of the elites who established them and who studied or taught in them, and also within a time frame which extends into the early modern period, we may be better positioned to understand their real impact on the ulama and the transmission of religious knowledge. There can be no doubt that the rise of the madrasa had a profound impact on the lives and interactions of the ulama. Madrasas were not perhaps as all-important and determinative as some had thought them to be, but they were linked to important developments in the world of Islamic learning and teaching, even if they didn't necessarily cause these developments. For example, as Daphne Efrat has pointed out, the spread of the madrasa followed closely on the crystallization of the madhahib, the discursive communities which henceforward would define the Sunni Muslim approach to legal questions. Not coincidentally, each madrasa was established for the benefit of one of these jurisprudential schools of thought. Eventually, some of the larger institutions were established with teaching chairs in all four of the madhahib, which together, by the later Middle Period, defined the parameters of acceptable Sunni legal thinking. The madrasa did not cause this development, but it was part of a larger social and intellectual process by which Sunni Islam in the Middle Period defined itself more precisely and limited the scope of what constituted acceptable legal discourse. The madrasa was also part of a process by which the ulama became professionalized, and their organization, if not bound to institutions, nonetheless became more systematic. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the madrasa is that they provided a regular income to those who taught in them. Whereas previously a scholar would have to rely on other sources of income, now an individual fortunate enough to secure a position in the madrasa could more or less count on steady monthly payments. Those positions were valuable, as Michael Chamberlain's account of the intense competition for them amongst the ulama made clear. Once a scholar had received an appointment to a position in a madrasa, he could maneuver to ensure that his sons or favored students inherited his teaching positions after him. In other words, successful ulama gained both standing and power in an increasingly institutionalized network of learning. Moreover, as members of the ruling elite, including sultans, came to establish and endow the bulk of the new institutions, the ulama grew increasingly dependent on the political class for their livelihood. They were not yet in any way employees of the state. The madrasas and their endowments were, as Maktazi stressed, private institutions. But the fortunes of scholars were now tied to those of the Seljuks, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, and other rulers. The question of how a distinctive group known as the ulama emerged is one of the most important, I think, for the proper understanding of pre-modern Islam. By the Middle Period, they played a critical role in virtually all Islamic societies. The madrasa played some important, if not yet fully understood, role in making it so, in creating a professional class of scholars that would influence all of Muslim society. And here I'm concluding. I think that our understanding of the significance of the medieval madrasa may shift a bit if we view it through the lens of developments in the early modern period, particularly under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were explicitly rooted in medieval models. Their understanding of their place in the world and of their relationship to Islam was shaped by the experience of earlier militarized Turkish regimes, such as the Seljuks and the Mamluks. They too were patrons of the ulama and religious institutions, just as their predecessors had been. But under the Ottomans, the system of religious education became much more regimented and institutionalized. Beginning in the mid-15th century, career paths amongst the ulama became more precisely defined and tied to the patronage not just of individual members of the political elite, but of the state. Institutions of religious learning mattered in a way they hadn't before. Ottoman madrasas themselves were carefully graded, from smaller and less prestigious institutions to the madrasas around the great mosque of Mehmed the Conqueror in Istanbul, which sat at the top of the institutional hierarchy. After Suleiman the Magnificent established his own mosque complex, the madrasas of the empire were formally ranked in 12 distinct grades. The hierarchy among them could be measured precisely in the differing level of pay which separated higher from lower ranking schools. Accomplishments in the field of religious learning was still not recognized by anything like institutional degrees, but there was now a precisely defined model for how a student should progress through the system, and students' advancement was carefully monitored. The curricula of the madrasas were increasingly regularized and fixed. So too was the career path of those who taught in them, not to mention that of the school's graduates, who went on to serve in a variety of religious, educational, and judicial functions. This was more than an informal cursus honorum. It was a systematic and regularized career path to which all were subject. The ulama were becoming, in fact, for the first time in Islamic history, employees of the state. Now, historians regularly credit the Ottomans with a particular genius for governance. But it does not undermine the creativity of the Ottomans to suggest, as I'm doing here, that some of their accomplishments, for example, their innovations in the organization of religious learning, can be viewed continuously with developments in the medieval Islamic world. As we saw, the medieval ulama became increasingly tied to the political elites through the rulers' patronage of institutions of religious learning. The employment of the Ottoman ulama by the state was, from one viewpoint, simply the next logical step. So too, for all their importance, medieval madrasas did not have a set curriculum, but they did help to regularize and professionalize the ulama, and a professionalized class of religious scholars were no doubt more open to establishing a standard curriculum and a regimented institutional network as a gateway to ulama status than were those of earlier centuries. This has, I think, historical implications which go well beyond the topic of religious learning. At the center of much recent scholarship on the Ottoman Empire and on the early modern Muslim world more generally has been the argument that modernity should not be seen as an explicitly and exclusively Western phenomenon, that the Ottomans and other early modern Muslims were busy constructing their own distinctive paths to the modern. The story of religious learning suggests that Ottoman modernity may have been deeply rooted in the medieval Islamic past. And of course, the story does not end with the Ottomans. I know, running out of time, so I won't say much right now about the state of religious learning in the modern Muslim world, except to remark that it's a complex story. The issues which animated the story of the ulama and the transmission of ilm in the pre-modern world, questions about the identity and training of the ulama, and the expression of their authority, the degree to which religious education was institutionalized, and the relationship of the ulama and religious learning to the state, these do not disappear, but manifest themselves in the modern world in new and sometimes contradictory ways. I'll stop there.